Clayton, you're muted.
I'm sorry about that. So as Elaine explained, I'm Clayton McCarl from the University of North Florida. I started doing digital editing with students in 2015. I was working on a colonial-era manuscript, and I was telling Jim Cusick from the PK Young Library of Florida History about the project, and he said, wow, that sounds like a lot of work. You must have students working on that. And it never occurred to me. And so I gave it a test run in the spring of 2015 with a couple of Spanish majors. They did it in the context of a directed independent study. And I learned a couple of things right away. First, what I assumed would be kind of a high technical barrier to getting started using TEI XML didn't actually exist. I was able to sort of explain XML and TEI XML in a few minutes, and they went off and started to do work. And that has been my experience ever since, that students really get it very quickly. And the further they get into it, the more they need to know, but students typically can figure that stuff out on their own. And the second thing I learned right away was that having students work on editing projects helps you to see things that you couldn't see otherwise. And those, because students ask questions that you wouldn't think to ask. They don't make a lot of assumptions about the way things ought to be done. And for me as a scholar, that has led me to see things to realize things I couldn't have known otherwise, and to think about things that weren't questions for me before. And that has been productive for me in terms of publishing the results of where those questions have led me. So after that, I spent a few years working on kind of a model for how to do this with students in order to, I've always credited the work that they do, but in order to compensate them beyond that. So I experimented with having students working as student assistants, earning work study, earning money through federal work study, and moved on to more formal internships for academic credit. I've had several students do that. Several of them who are in the Honors College at UNF have used these projects as their capstone, in fulfillment of their capstone requirements. And as Lynn mentioned, some of the students have also received funding through our Office of Undergraduate Research and through the Honors College for their work on these projects. coloniaLab is the umbrella project that I created to bring all of the various editing projects that I have in which I work with students all together. So the 4 students who are going to present today, they all got involved with coloniaLab and with digital editing in different ways. Emilia went on a study abroad course on a study abroad trip to Colombia with my wife and I in 2019. And the course that I taught as part of that trip was a digital editing course. So Emilia, the project she's doing now, she started already knowing a lot about how to do this type of work. Lynne, it was the student leader for the Editing the Earth MM White project at UNF last spring. She did that as an internship, and she's doing another internship with the project this spring with a different focus. So also the project that she's doing, that she'll talk about today, the project she's doing in Spanish, she began that with a lot of background in how to do this work. Georgina she took a digital editing course I taught last summer. And so that was the first time she had been exposed to it. The course was focused on digital editing. So the project she's going to talk about today was her project from that course. And Alexandra took a course on Latin American culture with me last fall, and the students had as an option for their final project to work on an editing project. So Alexandra volunteered to do that, and so the work she's going to be talking about today is part of a bigger project that several students have worked on, and she's the newest one to this kind of work. So I'm really glad that she was able to join us today. The projects that they're going to talk about represent different models. Emilia's project is entirely her own. She came to me wanting to do a capstone project, and she had an idea of the type of work she wanted to do. And I put her in touch with another faculty member at UNF, Dr. Denise Bosey, who helped her identify documents. And she's built the project from scratch. I've been basically the technical advisor. She's conceived the project and done it all on her own. Georgina's project, as I said, was her work from that summer course. It's her own project. It's a smaller project because it was a project that was undertaken in a 5-week summer course. Lynne's project started in that same Latin American culture course last fall, but as I mentioned, Lynne had a lot of experience, so she undertook a project entirely of her own. And then Alexandra's work is part of that class. Well, it's not a class project, but it was sort of deployed as a class project last fall. And so so her work is part of a bigger effort. And so with that, I'm gonna hand things over to the students. I'm gonna be putting links to the things that they're talking about in the chat. And so first up is Emilia Thom.
Hi, everyone. As Dr. McCarl mentioned, I became involved with digital editing through a study abroad trip to Colombia in the summer of 2019. And then last summer, I started my own digital editing project with the help of Dr. McCarl. The goal of my project has been to create a prototype digital archive with multiple documents to create a format that other students can follow while also making digital editions of primary source documents more available. I've been working on 5 different documents written by Spanish governors of Florida between 1715 and 1718 in the Spanish colony of St. Augustine. The letters are written by Spanish governors of Florida, Francisco de Corcoles y Martinez and Juan de Ayala Escobar. The letters are referenced in different historical works, primarily by John Worth, and they're very interesting if you have a chance to get to read them. Overall, my project has consisted of transcription, modernization, annotation, and providing historical context for the documents. I've found the annotations to be the most difficult because I wanted to annotate Indigenous words that are mentioned, towns and names, and with our knowledge of Indigenous history, those can be very difficult to define. The letters that were sent from Florida to Spain during the Spanish rule of Florida are key documents. They help us to understand the relations between colonists and Native Americans during the 18th century. I've really enjoyed working with these documents. It's required me to learn as much as possible about the Spanish relationships with the British colonies and the Native Americans during their occupancy of St. Augustine. With Spanish occupancy alone, I've learned that St. Augustine was not self-sufficient and needed Native American allies. And through my research on this time period and my work with the documents, it's clear that Native American populations were very active players in the colonial climate and chose colonial allies as long as it was in their best interests. The first letters that I edited were written in 1715 and 1716, and they tell of the arrival of the Yamasee Indians to Spanish Florida. The story of the Yamasee Indians is a really great representation of Native Americans as active players in that time period. They had lived in the British colony of Carolina for a number of years, but after suffering trade abuses, the Yamasee and other Native populations planned an attack on the British before leaving the colony. According by the documents that I've been working on, the Yamasee came to Florida seeking land and a Spanish alliance as a measure of protection from the British. The Yamasee always acted in their own best interest as they navigated the colonial landscape. I just feel that documents like these are really valuable to the historical community as digital editions where the primary source material is freely available and obviously less consuming to read than the original manuscripts. The project's still in progress, but all the items are currently listed as a part of the North Florida editorial workshop online, and draft editions are published on coloniaLab. I've really enjoyed working with these documents, and I've learned a lot about the history and politics of Florida. And so at this point, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Georgina, who's also been working on projects with Florida.
Hi. So as Dr. McCarl mentioned, I did my project as part of his summer digital textual editing course last year. And I went into it with no experience with digital editing, never having really worked with archival documents before, but I knew that I wanted to do a bilingual project as a Spanish major. So I ended up working with 3 documents from the East Florida Papers, which are the collection of documents that the US government received from the Spanish government when the US attained the Florida territory. And they're housed in the Library of Congress, but I was able to get digital copies. Dr. Cusick at the PK Young Special Collections Library at UF provided me microfilm copies of 2 of the letters I worked with. And the 3 documents are related to a fort that was here in what is now Jacksonville. It no longer exists, but it was a Spanish fortification called Fort San Nicolas. And it was important because it served as sort of a northern defense to St. Augustine, which would have been the capital of Spanish East Florida. And the first document that I worked with was a map from 1791, and it was created by Mariano de la Roque, who was a very important architect and engineer in St. Augustine. He worked on some important landmarks of that city, like the Castillo San Marcos, the Cathedral Basilica, I believe a convent that was there. So he designed this map, and it shows a lot of the different Spanish landmarks. But when I was working with this map, I noticed that it was upside down. The south was at the top. So in editing, this was a little bit of a challenge because I had to keep digitally rotating it. But I later learned that historically, it would not have been uncommon to draw maps this way. For example, in medieval Islamic cartography, a lot of times the maps would have been oriented that way. And when you think about it, you know, our planet is floating in space. So who's to say, you know, which way is up? And the way that we draw maps and perceive our globe nowadays has more to do with socio-political factors between the northern and southern hemispheres than it does any concrete truth about the way that our globe is oriented. So that was interesting. And then the other 2 documents were they were both intelligence correspondences from 1797 and 1800. And they were written by a soldier at Fort St. Nicholas to the then governor of Spanish East Florida, Enrique White. And Enrique White was the longest serving governor of Spanish colonial Florida. And these are just reports kind of telling him about what's going on in the day-to-day at the fort that he might need to know about. So the first document deals with a resident who was upset. She lived near the fort and she was upset because some soldiers had killed and eaten one of her pigs, and she wanted some money for it. It was a little bit of a drama, but she ended up getting paid. And the second document dealt with 2 Indians that had come to the fort searching for their escaped Black slave. And this was very interesting to me, and it opened up a lot of my research around this project as to the social and racial dynamics of Spanish colonial Florida at the time. And it turns out that Spanish East Florida would have been a haven for fugitive slaves escaping from plantations to the north, because there was an edict that stated that when they got here, they could petition for their freedom. But the Spanish were still practicing slavery as well. So in Spanish East Florida, we would have had free Blacks, enslaved Blacks, Black people that were enslaved by Native people, Black and Native Maroon communities cohabiting outside of the society. Within the society, there would have been various types of interracial and interethnic relationships. There would have been armed Black troops, likely stationed at Fort St. Nicholas. So this was very interesting, and I think it reveals something about the history of our state that is unique in its relation from the other the states to the north that were practicing plantation slavery. So with these documents in the course, I transcribed them. I regularized the Spanish to today's norms as far as the capitalization, spelling, the use of accent marks, and I also provided English translations. And then throughout the digital editions of each document, I provided some annotations with some context and background research about, you know, not only the cultural zeitgeist, but also particular places and names that are mentioned. So it was a great project. I learned so much. It transformed my perception of the history of North Florida. And it's also a project that I don't consider to be finished, because there are more documents available in the East Florida papers related to this fort that could also be edited and added to this project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alexandra.
Well, hello everyone. As you know, my name is Alexandra Zapata. I'm currently a junior at UNF. I did this as part of my Latin American culture course with Dr. McCarl in fall 2020. I worked on the project in conjunction with 4 other classmates who chose that as their final project. We worked on faces, and at the end of the semester, Dr. McCarl incorporated our contributions into the master XML for the project, which can be viewed through the coloniaLab website. I had the opportunity to work on the transcriptions and the TEI XML encoding on a census of slaves and freed people of African descent that conducted in Antioquia, a department of what is now known as Colombia in the 1840s. The document responded to a law from 1842 passed by the government of the Republic of New Granada that was primarily as a way to ensure proper payment taxes by landowners. I transcribed and encoded the folios 19V through 20V. Those folios contained a list of Sacojal, which lies in the north of Santa Fe in Antioquia and is now known as the municipality of Olaya. The opportunity to work with a set of lists with names that I have to transcribe into the modern version of them. These lists were divided by age groups and sex. The first dealt with current slaves and the second one with freed children from women slaves. It was a little bit challenging at first because it was my first time working with anything digitally like this. The pictures were a little blurry sometimes, and when you go to like the end of the page, it would not show completely what it was, so you have to like make up for it in your head. The uncommon names, the handwriting was a little bit uncommon because it was cursive. And also, like the program, we had to work with videos. So, and since we're due to COVID distance, it was all like a work of like emailing the professor and knowing what I'm doing is right and what if I wasn't doing the right thing. So it was a little bit challenging in that part. It's not like I can go to office hours and like talk to him and show him like everything. So, but it was actually a very fun experience to work on this because it was the first time that I was able to put names to people that were enslaved. Most of the time, we know that because of the colonizers, because those are the ones that knew how to write. And it was very fun knowing them and putting names to them and getting to actually perceive them as humans. Most of the time, we just like know all the slaves and that's it. But it was actually very fun to kind of like I like doing the project. I kind of was like, oh, I wonder how their lives were and like what did they do for fun and stuff like that. So it was a very fun project. I really enjoyed it with all the classmates. Like I was able to, I think I talked to Carol, like if I had any problems with anything, I would like, oh, can you help me here? Like, do you understand this? So it was actually very fun because besides the distance, we were able to like talk with other students and like communicate on what we were doing on the project. And I'll take it out to Carol now. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. So as Alexandra was mentioning, she worked on a digital project for the Fall Latin American Culture course with Dr. McCarl. I chose a kind of alternate final digital project. And in that case, I edited a document titled Las Esposas de los Conquistadores, which in English would mean the wives of the conquistadors, kind of literally. It was written by Soledad Acosta de Samper, a 19th to early 20th century Colombian writer and journalist. She also wrote a number of historical essays and articles related to Latin American history. And this particular document was a 21-page manuscript about the first Spanish woman to arrive to Latin America. The final published version of the article came out in a publication called El Centenario in Madrid, Spain in approximately 1892. I chose this document because the course introduced me to the Soledad Acosta de Samper digital library, and I wanted to look for a document that suited my interests, particularly in women's history and female historians, or just women writing history of the past, how they did that. This was particularly interesting for me because it was a new kind of document to work with. As was mentioned before, I have a bit of experience in TI XML encoding and creating digital editions, But I had primarily done that with correspondence and or kind of programs, booklets, things that were already like the final version published. I hadn't worked with manuscripts. So this was a new experience. This particular document was divided into numbered sections, each section focusing on about 1 or 2 women. Each section focused on a particular region of Central or South America. And in these sections, Acosta de Samper discusses generally like 3 main kinds of women. She discusses the women who had relationships with very famous conquistadors, like Catalina Suarez, who was Hernán Cortés's first Spanish wife, women like that with the kind of name recognition. She also talks about women who followed the more conventional life path for an elite Spanish woman in Latin America. She discusses marriage, remarriage, possibly multiple remarriages, and why that was. And then she talks about she discusses a few examples of women who are able to live exceptional lives and go a little bit beyond the kind of constraints of the female gender role in Latin for elite Spanish Latin American women. One example that she writes about to a greater length than most other women discussed in the article is Doña Beatriz de la Cueva, who was the first female colonial governor of Guatemala. The document goes into quite a bit of detail on her tragic death during a natural disaster. So in the process of working with this document, reading it closely to be able to transcribe it, encode it, edit it in Spanish, which was a bit more difficult than usual because I usually work with documents in English. I had to spend a good deal of time with the document and read it quite closely. And consequently, I was able to make some interesting observations related to it. As a student of history, one of the first things that caught my attention were particularly the sources that Acosta de Samper used. She uses primarily 16th, 17th century Spanish chroniclers. She does use one more contemporary source, Jose Milla, who is a 19th century Colombian chronicler. But what all of these sources have in common is that they're from distinctly male perspectives. They're the stories of famous men. And Acosta de Samper is trying to find the women in these stories, the feminine perspectives. And by doing so, she seeks to make visible the women important to Spanish conquest and what their role was in Spanish conquest. She's also quite critical of the conquistadors' treatment of the women in their lives, particularly Cortés, and he was not a very faithful man. And all of this, underpinning all of this, is a very European perspective, not even a Creole perspective, a perspective that relies on the stories of women who were born in Spain and traveled to Latin America later in their lives, which makes sense given the fact that this was published for a Spanish audience, that they would be interested in Spanish women in Latin America. I found working on this to be rather intellectually satisfying, but outside of my personal satisfaction of being able to kind of analyze and spend time with this sort of a document, I find that these sorts of projects are very beneficial to my kind of future goals in life. This is not the first editing project I've worked on, and it is not the last. But I find that the experience that I gain from these are useful to my future plans to become an archivist. They have opened kind of new ways to view and approach my field of interest. They allow me to ask questions about the ways to use these sorts of documents. And particularly, I find that working on these projects lets me explore different ways to use technology to increase access in archival collection. I found that particularly interesting. And I believe that will be of use in the future to be able to apply that in the field. Overall, though, I am glad to have been able to work with Dr. McCarl again and with coloniaLab officially this time to, again, continue to experiment with digital editing.
So I'll wrap up just by saying that what I began as sort of an attempt to harness student labor I think you can see from these students' presentations, has turned into something more. For me, as I mentioned, it's created opportunities for me in terms of my research, but also it's really changed the way I think about teaching. I think that in pedagogical terms, digital editing has a lot of really productive applications, and it's a really satisfying type of work to do with students. And I think that you can tell from what these students have talked about today, from the student perspective, it's really a lot more than just helping to type out stuff and put it into XML. I'm really proud of the 4 students who've presented today. I'm grateful that that they were willing to do this, and I'd like to thank FLDH for giving us this opportunity.